event is with Mary O'Malley. Mary's from Connemara, she's basically all the way a poet, and she has a lot of experience, first of all living overseas and also teaching on the MA in creative writing and those types of things. So she's going to talk a little bit about the writing process.
Thanks very much, John. John was reminding me that I'd read here before, but the name has changed, so I had no recognition of where I was going, which would have made no difference because I'm capable of getting lost in my own quite small house. What I thought I'd do was to start by reading you a couple of poems and just saying a few words, perhaps, about one particularly about them, and then I will ask you if you have any questions about the writing of, or what led, or what it is you want to know. I would probably, before we go as well, tell you just in very, very practical terms, because I'm a great believer in talking about the practicalities of writing a poem. The craft, if you like, and the habits you have to develop to write anything, really. If that's all right with you, but I want you to feel free to ask me anything at the point where I just pause, because that's what we're here for. I'll start with The Shape of Saying. They call it received English, as if it was a gift you got by dint of primogeniture. Maybe it was. Old gold words toned like concert violins, tuned to talk to God. After the French and Latin wars, I relished the poppies of dawn, though I thought that graceful foreign tongue was only meant for men, all right for the likes of Coleridge, but it gave me unpleasant dreams. They say we cannot speak it, and they're right. It was hard and slippery as pebbles, full of cornered consonants and pinched vowels, all said from the front of the mouth. No softness, no sorrow, no sweet lullabies. Until we took it by the neck and shook it. We sheared it, carded it, fleeced it, and finally wove it into something of our own, fit for curses and blessings, for sweet talk and spite, for the sound of hearts rending, the sound of hearts tearing. And I'll read a little piece of Ghost, which is from the same sequence. There's little mention here of grandmothers and mothers, for this is the book of fishermen and Englishmen. They hounded me and minded me, they shone like gods for me, and burnt all others out of the sky. One man at home among visions, one not given to ghosts, one that wrote of bravery and drowning, one that lived it. What could she do to match them? She heard only the cries out of the night depths. The sighs of the unclaimed drowned haunted her bedroom at the gable end. She was sure that some awful sight, a soaked soul, would break the night waters below Dunhill and come to her, shivering in the moonlight, to plead for burial. After a frozen moment, she would shimmer and dissolve like stained glass in a fire, leaving a blot like an unconfessable sin, a black spot on the tongue. That's from my second book, which I think of as the book that's a sequence of The Colonized Child. And I'm going to read one poem from my first book, and then I'll tell you why I'm doing this. Brushstrokes in stone. Donna Amalia was made homeless by South Africa in a casual kind of way. The man in the government office said, "Where are your records to show you were born in Namibia, and if you were, what were you doing in Angola on the 25th of April, 1974? Sir, I am here. I, Amalia, a woman of Africa. Give me my passport to go home. There was a war. My husband and my house are gone. They have taken it all. Give me back my name. Do you think I was never born? That this hand, this small head, this belly that has borne 3 children is something I am making up to waste time. You're holding me in paper chains. My nights are filled with signatures, twisting like eels in a sea of blue forms. They say they are important names. Will no one believe the marks I have made? This finger calloused from the needle, these palms bleached like a fish's underbelly from scrubbing marble floors. I have left my brushstrokes in the stone, and my caress glows on my children's cheeks. If I die waiting, will you not give me a little slip signed and sealed to say Amalia lived, a passport to eternity? So why not give it to me now and let me leave this place, this powder blue nightmare of stamps and notaries, each stamp a brand of pain. The official glanced up from his page. Signore, he said, this petition is out of date. That might explain my lifelong trouble with bureaucracy. So that last poem was from my first book. I had just returned from Portugal when I started writing what was to become that book. And the reason I wrote it first and not the one that the colonised child poems was because I knew I simply didn't have enough knowledge of my craft to do any sort of justice to the second and much more important book for me in many ways, more, I suppose, coming from somewhere deeper. And I was right. I'm now a little kinder to the first book than I was for a while, because I look on it as somebody a much younger me, and in some ways maybe a lot braver, and possibly a little bit wiser in some ways, I don't know. I wrote out of there are several reasons. I'm not sure about reasons, but I will say that I wrote because I grew up an inarticulate child. I was inarticulate in 2 languages. And I felt inarticulate in both languages. I remember feeling it very deeply in both when I was very young. I was 2 generations on one side away from Irish, and I was 1 on the other. I suppose 1 on the other. There was a good bit of Irish around, and there was Backwelth-ish, but so it was the language, if you like. The Sail Gaelach was very important to me. That I lived a Sail Gaelach. I lived an Irish life. If you like, culturally, but without the language. And that left me with an extraordinary lack, which is never quite, I mean, it's always there. We always write out of some kind of wound at a certain point, or perhaps not always, but often. I will now read a brief translation of, which book? Sorry. And I will stop then and open it up to you. This book has translations from both Lorca, who's one of my touchstone poets, and Sean O'Riordan, which is the one I'm going to read here. It's on Teangacha Leathlum. This language, half with me, is how I've put that in English. Who tied this knot between us, half tame, half owned tongue? There's a want in every line, unless you make me your own. There's another one beside you, and she's asking me home. I'm caught between the 2 of you, and it's tearing me apart. Unless I keep you with me, stroking your fur, I'll be robbed of your sanctuary, and you lose me forever. A half heart does no one any good. I'll just have to give in to you, though you're playing hard to get, my tuning fork language half understood. Sean O'Riordan in my particular version. So before I go any further, would anybody like to comment or ask questions about any of those or anything arising from them?
Could you elaborate a little bit more on the fact that you're inarticulate in two languages?
I think, yes. You know, Hartnett says dreaming in Irish and thinking in English. And that was to some extent my situation. But I'll tell you what it was. I only ever encountered the life I knew in Irish literature. Because for the most part, it didn't exist in English literature. I never saw it. I encountered a Connemara, a place, which was very wonderful in many ways and wild and all sorts of fantastic things about it. But it wasn't where I lived. I didn't know it. It sounded fantastic. It sounded like heaven in many ways. But I'd never been there, if that makes any sense. And then when I started reading, particularly in poetry is a little different because I loved poetry in English as well, because I loved it as song. I loved it as music. When I didn't understand, I loved metaphysical poets from very early. I love Shakespeare still. I mean, I still do with all of them. But they were at an oblique angle to me. It was fabulous music. Chaucer, funnily enough, I felt a bit closer to, perhaps because Elizabethan language was what came into us, you know, as English. And I was a bit more confident around that as I was around Shakespeare. But and intellectually and philosophically, the metaphysical poets appeal to nearly all kids of about 16 and 17 if they're well taught. And but the heart wasn't engaged in the same way. And also, I think the danger of writing in English is often that you will be too sentimental. Whereas write the same thing in Irish, it's much easier to avoid that sentimentality. I can't, you know, I don't know if that helps.
Yeah, it does.
Except that my Irish wasn't good enough. That was the thing, because we were taught in an English school, you know. And so out of that, that was probably initially why I wanted to write, the initial. Now, none of that matters actually to you as writers, any of you who are interested in writing. None of what I've just said, that's my story. People will be writing from different needs, different places, different points of view. So what are we going to do about that? You know, whatever your starting point, and I'm wondering about that. How do we move from that starting point into the poetry that you want to write? How do you know yourself what you want to write? How do you find out? What are the tools or the help you can get to do that if you don't already know? And if you do, you're probably, well, you do, and that's it.
So that sounds always right from the womb.
Well, I think to an extent, a lot of writers do, a lot of poets do. I wouldn't leave it that simplistically, because some write for song, some write professionally. You know, if you go back to the bardic schools, they spent 7 years learning very complex and crucifying sort of forms in some cases. If we talk about the Don Giroch, fascinating. But they did it because they were the chief's poets, and they had to flatter him, you know. So there are different ones, but I think you'll find a lot of people write out of a sense of something some hurt that they can assuage or deal with, or some level of perhaps making. I mean, it's commonly said that you do make sense of the world through writing it to some extent. So I suppose just on that simple level, you know, part of the job, I think.
What do you think was the catalyst for you actually to start putting that down on paper then?
There wasn't one. I knew from very young that I'd have to. I think what I did in practical terms, which I will talk about. In practical terms, I realised after my children were very young, and we moved back from Lisbon. I had in various points before made stabs at writing, but not because I was into drama, and I directed plays and that. And I, to this day, love theatre. But I had pushed it to one side, and I realised at a certain point that the price of that was simply too high. And I had to write. And so we came back to Ireland, and I made a decision, right, I'm going to write for a year. And if it's no good at that point, and I was quite stringent, I look back and I think I was strict with myself. If it's no good at that point, I will put it all aside and do something else or not, whatever. And towards the end of that year, as it happens, a friend literally got an envelope and put some of my poems. She said, here, I'm writing the address, and she had it stamped. Send these off to the Sunday Tribune, and they happened to be published. I would never have had the confidence in them or anything else myself to do it if she hadn't done it. But I went to a writer's workshop with Jessie Lendenny of Salmon Press, and I never brought a finished poem. Other people brought poems and read them out. I brought poems when I went that I was having trouble with or felt weren't finished, and I'd read them out and I'd know from listening to them. There was feedback as well. Some of it was excellent. Jessie was a very, very brilliant at feedback and very encouraging, but strict enough. And so that kind of paced me, that every week I'd have something that I had started to bring to the workshop, and I'd go home and finish it during the following week, if that's just practically. And she happened to come to me and say, I think Tom Lynch was over from America and said to her, is she going to publish that woman, or in his Tomish way? And Jessie actually said, you must have a manuscript by now. And I said, I haven't, because I hadn't. And she said, I think you have, and so on, and back and forth. And that's how it happened in my case. I have no idea at what point I would, if ever, have sent out work to have to be considered as a finished book if she hadn't done that. The second one was different. Then I was beginning to go into, and this is where I'll go on to the second book, the first poems I read of the colonised child, if you like, the one with the shape of saying. The only place I encountered anything close to my own life in poetry in English was in the work of Richard Murphy, which is one of the great ironies in this wonderful life. Richard came from exactly the background in the class, and he said to me afterwards when we got to know one another, oh, the people you were talking about such a family. And I said, no, not really. But of course I was really, because they were the only experience I had of this particular people of that background. And he said, they weren't quite that grand, which taught me a lot about register, how we're not able quite to judge those who are considered superior to us, or indeed the other way around. It applies just as well. And I got to know Richard subsequently, and because I encountered poems about a place that was real, and poems about people who were real. They weren't as I saw them, but that's not the point. They were real. And I remember sitting listening to him and my father. I have a poem called Tracing, about listening to them talking about pukons, about boats, the history of certain boats, what family owned which boat, which hooker, and something I'm interested in to this day. And by then I was starting on my second book, and John Montague came to read, and I met him afterwards, and I was a great admirer of his collection, The Rough Field, because he was doing in The Rough Field what I sort of wanted to do. It was the only thing I knew that was close to what I wanted to do myself. And he asked me what I was doing, and I said, I don't know, I'm just trying to write a book of my ancestry, really, to place myself at home where I'm coming from. And he said, that's what The Rough Field was about. And I didn't show him the poems or anything, but he was very encouraging about it, he was interested that I wanted to do that. And that gave me great, sort of spurt of energy, I suppose. And in fact, when the book was finished, he launched it, which was nice. So poets can be very generous in their way. And that was called Where the Rocks Float, second book. And that was very much where I wanted to place myself in a particular break in a line of extraordinary women, really, and men, survivors. And I never felt I had the strength they had. I was right, I didn't. But yes, there was a sort of, if you like, a completeness about the entire book. And perhaps because of that, I've almost always written in terms of whole book. You know, I think in terms of a book. It's not that I think in terms of a marketable entity, but just something I have to work out through the poems to some extent that I'm not even aware of at the time. Often it's aesthetic. It's something I'm working out aesthetically. So I now want to ask you to tell me a couple of things about yourselves, those of you who are interested in writing. Anybody want to kick off? Sheila.
I mean, I wouldn't be here if I hadn't an interest in writing.
Yes.
I wouldn't be here if I didn't know it was you. Well, I would be because I have an interest in writing, but the very fact that you are the person who's presenting this workshop, because of what I know of your writing. And in a way, it is the path that I want to take my writing along, or where it is taking me along at the moment.
That's more like it, yeah.
Yeah, where it is taking me at the moment.
Yeah.
And whatever that is that's taking me along that path, it's not always comfortable because it takes you into places within yourself and within the world that you kind of go, do I need to wear a flat jacket when I walk out of here? But it's, like you said at the beginning, it's something that I feel that we have to do.
Yeah, yeah. And you know, there are aids, there are helps, there are things you can do. Yvonne Boland, who we spoke about the other night, Yvonne was the one that probably I spent most time with talking about the specific poems, and she looked at my poems regularly. She would ask, can I see a few? And she would tell me exactly what she thought, which was wonderful, because it wasn't always nicey, you know, it was often very clear-eyed, as I would do to my own students, I hope. But generous always. And technical. She stuck to the technical. She never bothered commenting much on the, I don't think she did. We had other discussions about the subject matter, but we both agreed that you write about your subject matter is utterly your own business. It's how you write the poem, if indeed it is a poem, and how to make it become a poem or become a better poem if it's a poor, weak one. That was her great gift to me, and she was very exacting, which was also very useful. And you can do, she once said to me that I had, she didn't say unfortunate, but she meant it, a natural facility for rhyme, which people with Irish, who have come through poetry in Irish, I think have, as well as English probably. I just didn't find it particularly difficult, and I like music, so you know the cadence and rhyme come more easily perhaps. Now good rhyme is a different matter. And she said, and this gives your poems you have a tendency to write very good second last lines. How? And I said, yes, I had figured that out, Yvonne, but what am I going to do about it? And she said, rhymed couplets for a week might help you. But I loved writing the rhyme couplets so much. Every day I wrote a rhyme couplet and I thought, this is great. I had no worry about subject matter. I wasn't in them. I recommend it to anybody. I wasn't part of them. This wasn't coming out of my wound or my soul or anywhere else. And consequently, I got out of my own way. And that's one of the most difficult things for most of us to do, not alone earlier on, but you can end up in your own way again at your 8th, 9th book if you're not careful. So I think anything that helps you just get out of your own light and your own concerns and your own angst is a good thing. And I would recommend the Old Rhyme couplets for a week. I have several other things I can recommend, but if you're interested in poetry. Now, is anyone here interested in writing prose? Because that may be the case as well. You are? Yes. Any particular? Cynthia.
I'm working, I tend to write prose more naturally. I do some poetry, but prose
Is how you write.
Stronger.
Yeah. Stories or any particular kind?
Stories, young adult, children,
Oh, lovely.
and memoir.
Yeah. And who do you read? I mean, who would be, if I had to ask you for a top 3 at the moment, because obviously this changes or should change as we go through our lives to some extent. Who, if you give me a few examples.
I'm at a loss for recalling names now.
That's okay.
I'm on the spot now.
Yeah.
I read prolifically anything that falls into my hands.
Okay.
And I'm never without a book.
Yeah.
So I will read young adult, because that's what I'm thinking my audience
Yeah.
might be. Or I'll also read children's books.
Right.
As part of that.
Okay. And who do you read at the moment, Sheila? Who are your, at the current, let's say, are there people that are really interesting you?
I have just, and again...
Yeah, that's okay. Yeah.
And I've been reading more non-fiction, books by women in particular.
No, don't worry.
Yeah.
Is there anybody else that can shout out any books or anything that you reading or have read that you find particularly compelling for any reason?
Just read Science Mariner, and we're now reading The Bonfire of Vanities.
Okay, that's an interesting jump. I love that, actually, the fact that they're so different. Yeah. Are you in a book club or a group?
A group.
Yes.
More that it's not just a book club. I love that book. I like Mary.
Exactly. That's not.
Yes. We argue and fight and disagree about it.
That's excellent.
Yeah.
Yeah. Great. And where is that? Is that here in Achill or in Portlaoise? Okay. Okay. Great. Do you know Pat Bourne?
Yes.
Yeah, Pat's work. Yeah. Anybody else?
I've just read The Years by Annie
Proulx.
Ernaux.
Yeah, it's very interesting, actually,
Yeah.
isn't it? Yeah,
Absolutely, yeah.
it is.
And now I'm reading one about Algeria
Okay.
and the war, and it's very similar to what's happening right now.
Isn't it extraordinary?
And all the refugees coming into France.
Yeah.
How they're
And
looked at.
Senator now.
Hmm?
Is it the Anna Senator one?
No.
No.
Oh, it is. Yes, the author.
I haven't read that. I must have a look. Yeah. During lockdown, I reread War and Peace. I thought, well, it's not going to happen again. It was fascinating rereading it at that point. Dismiss rereading as one of the great things. You don't have to read everything. People sometimes think they have to have read all the latest books, and I think, why? Sorry, that is entirely I have never. Okay, my apologies. You go back to the great books for you as well as the new ones, and see how differently you read them at different stages. I think it's one of the most useful aids to writing, as well as sheer pleasure. Rereading War and Peace at that particular juncture for me, and then we're out of lockdown, and guess what? Here we go again. I'm not a particular. I think the other thing I'll say about writing is contemporary literature is only contemporary for a period of time. It doesn't remain contemporary for long. Yes.
Can I ask you a question? You mentioned that you are writing. I'm interested in when you move from writing individual poems to writing a book of poetry, and what the difference is.
Yes, that's a good question because I didn't explain it very well. Because I don't write a book of poetry. I may do so, and I've threatened to do it on one occasion. I don't write a book of poetry, but I find that there is something I'm working out that is running through a lot of the poems. In the case of the second book, Where the Rocks Float, that I read the few poems from at the beginning, I have several sequences, and I do write a lot of sequences, not always to my editor's delight, but anyway. And the reason sequences can be useful is where you are exploring something, but not from that logical, tied-in, closed narrative way. And yet you are looking at the same thing on let's say a multi-level or multi-layered poems. But the poems, you don't particularly need the poems to be standalone because you want the reader to have the heads up that they're actually linked. That's the reason I do them. I'm not saying that's what everybody else does. Does that help?
It does.
Is that to clarify?
Yeah, I'm at a stage that I've got a lot of disparate work.
Yes.
I'm not sure whether I should focus on a theme to pull them together, and whether that's a bit artificial.
I think personally, I don't have a theme.
Okay.
I mean, that fell into that second book because of what it was. And the first book was, a lot of it was set in Portugal for the simple reason that that's where I lived, before I started writing them. But, well, what can I say? If the disparate poems are there, I would gather them together as what they are. And why not? Why not? If I have the need to write on a particular sequence, to thread something through in a book, I probably will do it maybe once in my life. Some people do it a lot. I think it's entirely up to the individual writer, but I think it needs to be a good poetic logic underlining it to make it successful or necessary, if you see what I mean. Who do you like to read? Who are your poets of choice at the moment?
Well, Heaney.
Yeah.
Böll, he's my touchstone.
Yeah.
I live in England, and
Yes.
I'm very lucky to have a correspondence with a poet called Emma Peacock.
Okay. Oh yeah.
Who is an amazing writer
Hmm.
in her early 90s now.
Yeah, yeah.
And she wields a knife if I send her something.
Oh, that's fantastic.
She's
Yeah.
perfect.
That's the most valuable thing you can have, I think, really. If you trust one another.
Yes.
Yeah, that's great. Do you read Hughes at all? I'm very curious about whether I loved Hughes.
I do like him and never
Yeah.
go off him. I think he's a
I know.
bit of a, but yes,
Yeah.
sometimes he can reach places that other poets can.
Indeed, he can. And what about Harrison, Tony Harrison? Does anyone read him anymore?
Yeah,
Yeah.
I have done. He has a lovely one about his father and bookends.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
We had him over in Courch in Galway when I was organising that festival, or one of a team organising it. We did, and he was very generous actually. We had him over both with an actor called Barry Rutter, who was Theatre North, Manchester based. He led that for a long time, and he was wonderful. And Tony Harrison said he was the actor he wrote for because when God spoke, for his miracle plays, when God spoke, he didn't speak with a public school accent when Barry Rutter was there, but the rest of the time he did. Yeah, okay. You're very lucky to have that. That's a treasure, absolutely. Yeah. Anybody else? Are you all interested in writing, or some of you not? Anybody else?
We're looking to be inspired.
Oh, okay.
No pressure.
No. Why, as a matter of interest, why would you want to write poems now if you're not already writing them? That's a genuine question. Because you must have a need or an interest in writing them. So I'm just curious.
I wrote when I was like a late teenager.
Okay.
And I haven't written in 20 years. I'm just maybe trying to get the spark back, or that's why I was asking you earlier about what would be the catalyst for you to actually start.
Okay.
Everyone has a lot of subject matter in their head, for sure, that they could potentially express. And I'm just wondering about.
Who do you read because that's the most important thing that I can say to you.
Yeah.
If you want to write again,
Yeah.
read poetry, read poets.
I mean, I'll come to poetry in a minute, but just on the maybe theme this weekend, or one of the themes, ecology, biodiversity, environmentalism. So I'm reading a lot of books along those lines. I'm actually reading Owen Dalton's book at the moment, an Irish rainforest, Mark Boyle's The Way Home. Don't know if you're familiar with any of these. They're kind of good, like.
I'm familiar with them, but I haven't read them. Yeah.
Self-sufficiency and sustainability, things like
Yeah.
that. On the poetry level, I mean, Yini was mentioned earlier. I would have poet would have resonated with me, especially maybe my age group.
Do you read poetry in Irish at all?
No.
Because the canon of Irish poetry, by definition, includes what I would call very environmentally aware poems. It's not often said. I mean, maybe it's not said often enough. But or indeed, if you read the writers like Liam O'Flaherty or Martin Diron, or of course, it's the inhabited landscape they're talking about. It's not a dehumanized landscape. It's the inhabited landscape, which I think is the important one, perhaps. It might be worth having a look at some and finding translations, just think of doing that. I worked for 25 years or more as part of a loose team involved in environmental, mostly the ocean, and it's still an issue for me, protection of the ocean. And this was the Bog Week and Sea Week. And I worked with teams of scientists. And I'm a physicist manqué. I'd love to have been a physicist. So I get a lot of, that's crept into a lot of my last 3 books. So, the poems are not written from the point of view, obviously, just about physics. They're help me look at time, which is my current at this stage. I've always actually been fascinated by time. I loved the early part of the book of, we didn't have a Bible, because it wasn't the thing to have. I should be careful. But when I read that passage about creation, I just loved it, and I still do. And really what it is what writers are constantly doing, is they're separating out, they're trying to carve up space into manageable sections. So there's God, and it's all a big old wad, like dark matter, really. And then he separates light from dark. Okay, now we're getting somewhere. The earth from the water. Chaos and harmony. And so even at this point, it's hitting me afresh how, okay, now we're getting somewhere. This is what we're at. And that's why I'm so fascinated by physics, I think. They have these frontiers, and I know biology has as well. I simply don't know them. So, whatever the area is, it'll feed into, if you let it, I think, what you're writing. I would say. I'll just mention another, I'm a great believer in exercises, particularly when you're getting started, but you must be reading. I can't stress that enough, because that's where you develop your sense of poetics and your sense of, sorry, I'm just going to ask John a question. John, when it's finishing time, just give me the signal, otherwise I'll go on for about 3 more minutes, because the next people have to come in. Sorry, I've lost my train there. Yeah, exercises will, the reading gives you the aesthetics and the knowledge of poetry that you need. It's not a simple, it's something you need to work at, It's like musicians, they spend a long time learning to play that instrument. And you're learning to play your instrument, basically, which is language. So learning to pay attention to language is incredibly important, whatever that language might be, I think. And then making it do the thing you need it to do, till sometimes it'll come in, slant from left to field and surprise you, and you'll have a poem. It'll be just there, ready-made. But it won't happen unless you've tuned the instrument enough so that you can write it. Does that? I think. And that's why I'm a believer in exercises, particularly in the beginning, because a lot of them will be awful, or at least mine would be, and have been. But then suddenly you'll find something, you click in, and it's practice, and it means you're doing it every day, you know, or every, whatever, 3 days a week, whatever it is. The thing I would usually say is don't sit waiting for inspiration. Because, you know, the old joke about the day it comes visiting, you won't be there.
What inspiration did you take from living in Portugal?
I'm a very southern person, so the other half of me is really very happy to be in Spain or Portugal. So it would influence me a lot, but it influenced me a lot because I live there, but also because I read. I would say half of my reading is in Spanish and some in Portuguese, often in translation, but in both maybe. Poetry in both, but novels in translation, good translation. Because I like how they deal with certain things. It suits Irish, I think, first of all, and it suits how I am, and I think I understand it. And one of my first great loves was Lorca. So myself and Michael Hartnett shared that passion for Lorca. And because the poetry has a lot of music in it, usually, as well. Thank you very much. Will I finish with a short poem? Okay. I'll finish with a short poem. This is a poem about a moth. And moth life. Cleaning behind the sofa, I came across one on the floor, a desiccated husk, its tiny sails inscribed with Om or Pi or some pale encrypted code written by owls. Space is full of them. Ghost moths beating our light towards our light, particles made manifest, the pattern wings fine brush strokes figuring matter, as they fly, silent as child ghosts. Their poems emit silver pulses, mysterious and steady as Rambo's illuminations. Thank you very much. I want to thank John again. Thanks, John.